A flight attendant was aggressive toward a black CEO, but he calmly turned the situation around and signed the flight crew's termination orders before the plane even landed. He jammed a fork into the black CEO's hand, thinking pain would break his composure. He didn't realize calm was the CEO's weapon, and retribution was already written. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always meets decisive justice. The metal clink of the aircraft door echoed like a closing vault. Darian Crosswell's polished shoes tapped once on the threshold of Meridian Sky Flight 814 as he stepped inside. The air, already cooler than expected, scented faintly with disinfectant and static. He didn't pause to smile at the crew or scan the interior. His mind was sharp, movements direct. This was not a leisure flight. It was a mission. Get to Avalar by dawn. Finalize the acquisition that would keep his company's future out of the hands of predators. That was the objective. Everything else was background noise. He moved to his assigned seat, 1A, first class, and placed his briefcase beneath the seat in one smooth motion. 2 rows back, his assistant Jalen Merrick quietly settled in, already pulling out a notepad and digital pen. The young man gave a quick glance toward Darian, who nodded once. Silent communication. Years of field coordination had made that a habit. The hum of passenger chatter vibrated lightly around them, but something beneath it, subtler than sound, drew Darian's eyes to the front of the cabin. A man in a sharply pressed uniform, late 40s with close-cropped dark blonde hair, stood at the galley partition. He wasn't looking at the manifest or briefing with the other attendants. He was watching Darian, unblinking. Their eyes met. Darian held the gaze for only a second longer than necessary, then broke it, returning to his tablet. He opened the contract files, 2 rival bids already stacked on top of Stratosign's valuation sheets, and began scanning for inconsistencies in the latest proposal. But his mind tugged backward, unsettled. The flight attendant had stared too long. Corben Hade. That was the name stitched above the man's breast pocket. From the corner of his eye, Darian noticed movement. Corvin leaning slightly toward another crew member, a younger man with pale brown hair and a slight stoop. The two exchanged a few quiet words, and then the younger one, Reddick Thorne according to his badge, turned to glance toward the galley. Darian followed the trajectory of that glance. A tray of utensils sat unsecured on the galley counter. Stainless steel. Forks, knives, serving spoons. The reflection of overhead lights flickered against their polished edges like tiny warnings. Darian exhaled slowly. He had trained for this kind of unease before, in boardrooms where executives tried to shake his concentration, during negotiations designed to corner him with time pressure or legal ambiguity. This was different, more primal. There was no meeting table here, no legal counsel at his side, just cabin pressure, forward motion, and strangers with unchecked access. He returned to his tablet, fingers calm but deliberate. If they were trying to get a reaction out of him, they would fail. Composure wasn't a luxury, it was armor. Behind him, Jalen leaned slightly into the aisle and whispered just above the hum of the engines. "Sir, I think something's off with the crew. They keep looking this way." Darian didn't turn. "Stay seated. Eyes forward. Document anything unusual." Jalen gave a tight nod and sank back into his seat. The final boarding call crackled faintly over the intercom. The last passenger took their seat somewhere in coach. The overhead bins clicked closed, and a low chime signaled the crew to prepare for departure. The cabin lights dimmed. Corvin moved briskly toward the cockpit, but paused briefly beside Darian's row, adjusting his collar unnecessarily. His elbow grazed the curtain, but his eyes scanned Darian's face like a chess player sizing up his opponent. He didn't say a word. Darian didn't flinch. The engines growled to life beneath them, vibrating through the metal floor. The aircraft began its slow roll away from the gate. Still, that strange stiffness clung to the crew. It wasn't the normal choreography of flight attendants switching into routine. It was too synchronized, too aware. Darian's eyes narrowed slightly. Something had been planned before he boarded. A sequence, a trigger, perhaps even a script. He tapped his smartwatch twice, setting it into passive audio monitoring. He wasn't paranoid. He was prepared. The plane climbed, wheels tucked away beneath them, lights outside the windows shrinking into constellations of civilization below. In the glow of the cabin, Darian's reflection stared back at him faintly in the darkened tablet screen. Unmoved, untouched, but not unaware. Behind that gaze was 1,000 calculations, a man who had built firewalls for government agencies, who had ghost-written security protocols for major airlines, who once walked out of a corporate raid with nothing but a pen and still negotiated a $90 million settlement by sundown. He knew when systems were compromised, when behavior strayed from protocol. And this crew was not operating on instinct. They were operating on instruction. Still, he focused. The documents awaited. The merger depended on his clarity, not his suspicion. And yet, the tray hadn't moved. The crew kept glancing, and Corvin's hand, even when idle, always rested too close to the galley entrance. For a moment, Darian let himself believe it was coincidence. But somewhere, buried in his gut, something shifted. The aircraft leveled. The tension did not. And while Darian believed he was here to finalize a deal, the real confrontation waiting for him was something no negotiation could prepare him for. This flight would test not his company, but his resolve. As the plane leveled into its cruising altitude, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, casting a soft glow over the first-class section. Corvin Hale stepped through the aisle with an air of mechanical hospitality, balancing a tray of drinks with one hand and his practiced smile with the other. He paused at seat 2C, greeted the elderly man in a gray suit with a generous pour of white wine, then leaned toward the couple in 2D and 2E, offering cocktails with a charming nod. But when he reached seat 1A, Darian Crosswell's seat, he skipped it entirely. Jayla Merrick, seated 2 rows back, noticed the omission instantly. Leaning forward just enough to catch Darian's attention, he tapped his shoulder lightly and whispered, "They're deliberately skipping you." Darian gave a slow nod, but didn't turn. His face remained composed, gaze still fixed on his tablet. "Let's observe a little longer," he murmured. Moments later, Corvin returned. This time, his smile was thinner, almost stretched too tightly across his face. In his hand, a glass of water balanced precariously on a napkin, and atop it rested a stainless steel fork, oddly placed, as if it were more symbolic than functional. Without asking or acknowledging Darian, Corvin set the glass down with enough force for the fork to rattle against the armrest. "Water," Corvin said flatly, as though the word alone excused the manner. His eyes didn't linger on the drink. They flicked upward, meeting Darian's with something closer to challenge than service. "Thank you," Darian replied evenly, voice calm, face unreadable. Corvin's jaw twitched. The lack of reaction wasn't what he wanted. His gaze hardened for half a breath before he turned away, walking back toward the curtain that separated first class from the galley. Behind that curtain, Reddick Thorne stood still, his body half-shadowed, watching. His hand gripped the service handle, knuckles widening. The moment passed in awkward silence. 2 passengers across the aisle exchanged looks. One coughed gently. The air had changed. Corvin returned again, this time empty-handed. "Sir," he began, "may I confirm your boarding group?" Darian didn't look up. "Group A1, he replied. "It's printed on the ticket stub in the seat pocket." Corvin didn't check. Instead, he took a slight step closer. "And your seat assignment?" "First class was a bit overbooked." "I'm in the correct seat," Darian replied, now lifting his eyes to meet the attendants. "You scanned it yourself." Corvin gave a faint, dismissive laugh. "Routine verification, sir. Don't take it personally." "Noted," Darian said. From behind the curtain, Reddick shifted again. His hand tapped twice on the metal wall, soft, intentional. Darian heard it. He noted the timing, the rhythm. A signal. Corvin wasn't done. "Sir," he said, voice now low enough that only Darian could hear, "I'll need your cooperation with all instructions going forward. Quickly, if you please." Darian tilted his head. "What instructions?" Corvin's eyes lit up for a second, like a fuse catching flame. "The ones meant for passengers like you." There was a quiet aggression wrapped in civility. The kind of statement meant to provoke. Darian pressed his thumb against his smartwatch, feeling the faint vibration confirming audio recording had started. His voice remained steady. Would you like to clarify that? Corvin stepped back half an inch, smirking. The rules apply differently for certain travelers, Mr. Crosswell. 2 rows back, Jalen straightened slightly, his fingers curling around the handle of the briefcase he carried. He didn't move yet, but his eyes stayed locked on Corvin. Darian could feel the shift now, not in the air, but in intent. This wasn't about a seat or a drink. It was a calculated push, a test to see if Darian would snap, if he could be baited into losing the composure that defined him. Passengers nearby sensed something too. One man paused mid-sentence in his conversation. Another angled his phone slightly higher, as if thinking about recording. The tension threaded through the space like a wire being pulled tight from both ends. Corvin stepped back again, but didn't leave. He glanced toward Reddick, who now had both hands on the galley divider. His body was coiled like a spring. Waiting, Darian slowly reached for the glass of water. He lifted it with his uninjured hand, the fork clinking softly against the rim. He didn't drink it. He set it back down, eyes never leaving Corvin's. In his mind, scenarios formed. Threat assessment, exit strategy, communication trees. He'd taught dozens of security teams how to respond to covert threats in corporate environments. But never had he imagined needing those same protocols for a commercial flight. Corvin turned, this time with something like disappointment in his gait. Darian hadn't given him the outburst he hoped for. Not yet. As Corvin reached the galley curtain, Reddick leaned in. He's not biting, he muttered. Corvin's voice returned, hushed but clipped. He will. Darian tapped his smartwatch again, switching the audio log to encrypted storage. He looked over his shoulder toward Jalen, then gave a small nod. Whatever this was, it wasn't random. It was deliberate and escalating. Darian shifted in his seat, letting his eyes sweep the cabin. He studied the placement of crew members, the overhead compartments, even the weight of the metal tray that sat near the curtain's edge. Every detail now mattered. Every second counted. And somewhere between the soft hum of the engines and the growing silence of the cabin, Darian understood. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was an approaching storm. Darian realized this was no misunderstanding. This was an approaching storm. Corvin's voice sliced through the tension like a thin wire drawn too tight. "Move the briefcase," he said coldly, gesturing to the perfectly aligned leather case at Darian's feet. Darian looked up, his expression unreadable. "It's already within regulation clearance," he replied, voice calm, professional. But Corvin didn't move. His posture shifted closer, arms folded, eyes narrowed, as if scanning for weakness. "Then move it again," he said. There was no justification, no protocol, no courtesy. Just an order for the sake of domination. Darian slowly bent down and shifted the briefcase barely an inch. The subtle rustle of his suit sleeve brushing the seat edge felt louder than it should. Corvin's lips curled in faint disdain. "Still looks off." Passengers nearby glanced over now, sensing the unease thickening like smoke. Row 3 turned first, then a man in row 5 pulled down his headphones. Darian did not react. His hand rested on the armrest, fingers loosely curled. The silence between him and Corvin wasn't passive, it was electric. He understood exactly what was happening. A provocation. A bait. And yet, this wasn't his first time walking a high wire. From behind the cabin curtain, Reddick Thorne strolled forward slowly, pretending to check the overhead bins. But his eyes didn't move from Darian. They didn't need to. He wasn't here for luggage. Corvin took another half-step forward, enough to breach what little personal space remained. The air between them shrank. His breath smelled faintly of coffee and something metallic, likely nerves. "You're now in non-compliance," Corvin whispered, voice sharp and rehearsed. "You've been advised. Do not escalate further." Darian's tone did not rise. "Escalate what? I am seated. I am silent. I'm in order." Corvin leaned down, so close his tie brushed Darian's shoulder. "You people think silence is power, but silence doesn't erase where you belong." Jalen Merrick, seated 2 rows behind, stood halfway up, alarm flashing in his eyes. "Sir," he began, but Darian lifted a quiet hand without turning. "Stay seated, Jalen." His voice was steady, commanding, enough to freeze his assistant mid-motion. The lights overhead flickered briefly, only once, but the moment registered with every pair of eyes watching. Turbulence shivered through the aircraft, rattling the service cart behind Reddick. Corvin staggered slightly and steadied himself by gripping the edge of the tray table near Darian's seat. That was when Darian noticed it. Corvin's fingers brushed across the edge of the utensil tray with just a second too much familiarity. Darian's mind began calculating. Pressure points, angles, responses. But still, he did not move. Corvin stared down at him. "You want to play this the long way?" he hissed. "I'm not playing anything," Darian replied evenly. "I'm on a flight. You're performing a role. One of us is failing." Reddick took one more step forward, now only feet away. His walk had shifted, no longer casual, but poised. "Ready." Corvin's jaw clenched. He shifted his weight as though battling an invisible clock inside his head. Around them, phones were beginning to lift. Quietly, cautiously. Several passengers had already started recording. Still seated, Darian allowed his right hand to slide slowly from his thigh toward the inner seam of his jacket. Not to retrieve anything, only to prepare. His fingers flexed, brushing the band of his smartwatch. The device's screen lit up briefly under the edge of his sleeve. Corvin noticed. His breathing quickened. He glanced at Reddick, who gave the smallest nod. And then, Corvin's eyes dropped to Darian's hand on the armrest. He didn't blink, didn't speak. His fingers twitched, and the tension, coiled for too long, reached its snapping point. Corvin's gaze hardened. His shoulders squared. Darian saw it before it happened, and the moment became suffocating. And then Corvin made the move that would ignite everything. The fork struck with a sickening thud. It didn't glance or graze or slip. It sank, full and deliberate, into the thickest part of Darian Crosswell's left hand. The metal prongs buried themselves just past the flesh of his palm, jagged enough to draw immediate, pulsing blood. The cabin, only seconds before filled with a low hum of conversation and engines, fell into instant silence. Gasps tore through the first-class section like the rip of fabric. A woman in row 2 covered her mouth. A businessman dropped his tablet. A young man near the aisle clutched the seat in front of him, frozen between standing and disbelief. Darian didn't scream. He didn't even flinch. His eyes, calm and unreadable, stayed locked on Corvin Hale's face, the face of the man who had just stabbed him with a dinner utensil in the middle of a flight. Corvin, too, seemed caught off guard, as though he had expected something more theatrical, panic, retaliation, shouting. But instead, he was met with an eerie stillness. Reddick Thorne, stationed near the curtain like a coiled snake, sprang into motion. His voice, loud and rehearsed, cut through the silence. He just attacked the crew. He struck first. Somebody help restrain him. But no one moved, because no one believed it. Darian's hand trembled, not from panic, but from the blood loss, his fingers twitching instinctively as they tried to protect the wound. The silver fork jutted from the middle of his palm like a grotesque flag. And still he didn't cry out. Instead, his breathing slowed, deepened, controlled. The smartwatch on his right wrist beeped softly, unnoticed by most, but not by him. It had automatically switched from discrete audio capture to full video recording mode, framing every detail of the incident with clinical precision. The lunge, the impact, the blood. Corvin took a step back, as if realizing for the first time what he had actually done. Darian's eyes narrowed. His fingers curled around the base of the fork. And then, without a sound, he pulled it out. The metal slid free with a slick noise, trailing a thin stream of blood that slid across his palm, down his wrist, and onto his suit pants. The sharp pain should have made him stagger, should have been his knees, but it didn't. He stood straighter. A collective gasp rose from the cabin again, this one different. Less horror, more awe. Still holding the fork, Darian raised it slowly. Not to threaten, not to retaliate, but to present it. He held it up like a surgeon revealing an instrument used in malpractice, lifting the evidence into the overhead lights, so every camera, every recording phone, Every trembling witness could see it for what it was. A weapon. Passengers began whispering, recording, some openly demanding that someone do something. A man in row 5 stood and shouted toward the cockpit, "We need the captain now." Behind them, Reddick faltered. The lines he had prepared were crumbling. His confidence wavered as the narrative he had tried to spin fell apart. No one was rushing to help him. No one was believing the lie. Jalen Merrick rushed down the aisle, pushing past stunned passengers with urgency on his face. "Darian," he called out, reaching for his mentor. But Darian's uninjured hand lifted in a commanding gesture. "Halt. Not now. Not yet." Jalen stopped mid-step, visibly torn between concern and obedience. Darian shifted. He turned fully to face Corvin, whose chest now rose and fell with ragged, uneven breaths. The flight attendant's professional mask had crumbled, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting toward the exit, and a sheen of sweat coated his brow. "You don't understand." Corvin started, gesturing vaguely toward the aisle, as if the fork had somehow acted on its own. "No," Darian said, voice low, calm, cutting through the rising tension like a razor. "Don't rewrite this." He turned his gaze slowly, deliberately, to the passengers around him. "Every one of you saw what happened," he said. "You saw the moment. You saw the intent. This," he held the bloodied fork a few inches higher, "was not an accident." Corvin opened his mouth again, but the man behind Darian, a father traveling with a young son, interrupted with a firm voice. "We saw it. He never touched you. You stabbed him." Another man nodded, phone still recording. "I've got the whole thing." And then another voice. "Me too." Corvin took a shaky step back. I didn't mean, but it was too late." The evidence now floated in the air around them, in hands, in voices, in lenses. The attack wasn't something that could be rationalized away. It had been captured in full, and worse for Corvin, it had been met not with violence, but composure. Darian's breathing was even now. He took a small cloth napkin from the service tray and wrapped it around his bleeding hand. His motions were slow, deliberate, steady, like a man performing surgery on himself without anesthesia. Every eye remained on him. And then Darian stepped forward, having the distance between himself and Corvin. Their eyes locked. The silence thickened, more suffocating than the recycled cabin air. Darian didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He didn't accuse. Instead, with the presence of a man who had spent his life defusing boardroom wars with nothing more than precision and presence, he delivered the one sentence that changed the course of everything. "You just ended your own career." Reddick lunged. The sudden movement cut through the already tense atmosphere of the cabin like a blade through fabric. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the aisle as he tried to barrel his way forward, eyes locked on the bloodied fork still in Darian's grip. But he didn't get far. A businessman in a charcoal blazer stepped into his path, shoulder squared, voice firm. "Not another step," the man said, his hand raised not in threat, but in silent command. Reddick hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. The spell was broken. Passengers around them stood up, blocking the aisle like human barricades. Some yelled at Corvin. Others called out for the captain. Phones were up now, recording, live streaming, documenting. And in the middle of it all, surrounded by a storm of voices and eyes, Darian Croswell stood like an unshakable axis. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Blood soaked his left hand, but there was no trembling. He moved only when Jalen pushed through the crowd with a white cloth from his carry-on, gently pressing it into Darian's palm. "Here," Jalen said, his voice low, urgent. "You need pressure." Darian nodded once, wrapping the cloth around his hand with one sweep and tightening it himself. He never looked down. His eyes remained fixed on Corvin, watching each breath, every twitch, as if memorizing the man's breakdown in real time. Corvin's posture, once puffed with arrogance, had begun to sag beneath the weight of consequences he hadn't imagined. The plane rocked with a pocket of turbulence. Overhead bins rattled like warning drums. A tray clinked against the floor somewhere in the back. Still, Darian didn't flinch. "Not an inch." "Open the briefcase," he said. Jalen blinked. Now. Bottom compartment. Protocol ledger. Passengers exchanged glances. The phrase meant nothing to them, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. Jalen crouched beside Darian's seat and unlocked the briefcase with 3 precise clicks. Inside, under contracts and sealed reports, he pulled out a folder unlike any of the rest, thicker, bound in a matte black cover with a silver tag marked Emergency Protocol. Executive trigger only. Darian didn't even have to explain. He just turned slightly, allowing the camera lenses trained on him to catch the folder clearly as Jalen placed it on his lap. Near the curtain dividing first class from the galley, Corvin leaned toward Reddick. His whisper barely reached them, but the desperation was clear. "We need to get control back before this becomes irreversible." "Too late," murmured someone nearby. Passengers were now more than observers. They were witnesses. And some, like the young man in row 5, were speaking up. "I saw the whole thing," he said aloud, turning toward the others. "He didn't do anything. That flight attendant stabbed him." A father from row 3 stepped forward next, motioning toward Darian. "You can use my seat if you need space. Anything you need." Darian raised one calm hand, not to reject help, but to settle the wave building in the cabin. His voice, when it came, was low but unmissable. "Everyone stay seated. Document what you can, but stay calm." Several passengers nodded. The energy shifted again, less chaos, more coordination. Darian stepped into the aisle, gripping the back of his seat for balance. Blood still seeped faintly through the cloth, but his gaze never wavered. "Captain," he called, voice firm, "I'm requesting your presence." Now. No response. A beat passed, then another, and another. The cockpit remained sealed, silent. Darian's jaw tightened. Behind him, Jalen looked toward the front, worry flickering in his eyes. "Should I press the call button?" "No," Darian said. "We're past that." He looked down the aisle again, then drew a breath that filled his chest like a steadying brace. "If the captain won't act," he said loud enough for all to hear, "then I'll escalate matters myself." The effect was immediate. Reddick, wide-eyed, surged forward once more, but this time he didn't get far. 2 passengers intercepted him in unison, one grabbing his arm, the other pressing him back against the side of the seat. Reddick flailed for a second, yelling something about procedure, about compliance, but no one listened. Not anymore. Corvin took a step back. The blood had drained from his face completely. He looked less like an authority and more like a cornered man, his chest rising in shallow, panicked bursts. And that was when Darian spoke again, this time to him directly. "Your choices," he said, each word smooth as glass, "just invited federal protocol into this cabin." The silence that followed was absolute. The cockpit door hissed open with a mechanical click, cutting through the rising tension like a scalpel. Captain Harlan Vex emerged, his brow furrowed, shoulders squared, and eyes darting across the scene that sprawled before him. Blood smeared on the cabin floor, trembling crew members, and a stunned silence pierced only by the distant hum of jet engines. His gaze flicked immediately to the source of that silence. A black man standing calmly in the aisle, fork in hand, wrapped in a sanitary cloth like an artifact being preserved. Corvin Hale spoke first, his voice cracking under pressure. "Captain, he attacked me." He lunged, but the captain's eyes didn't follow his words. They locked instead on the other passengers, dozens of them, phones raised, all pointed not at Darian Crosswell but at Corvin. The story had already moved past crew control. The narrative had slipped out of their hands and into the lens of every live stream in the room. Dramatic irony struck hard. The crew's supposed authority had become irrelevant in the face of recorded truth. Darian stepped forward without flinching. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. He simply held out the blood-stained fork with steady hands and said, "Let's start with facts." The briefcase Jalen Merrick carried was already open in the seat beside them. A sealed wrap had been removed minutes earlier, used to prevent contamination of the metal used in the attack. Darian gripped the handle through it now, like a courtroom exhibit awaiting submission. The weight of it felt heavier than steel, more like a turning point made visible. "I was seated when your senior attendant, Mr. Hale, approached me With escalating aggression, Darien began, his voice smooth but charged with quiet authority. He delivered this fork along with a drink, then falsely accused me of obstructing a service lane. I remained seated. He then proceeded to stab me in the hand. Around him, phones caught every word, and the captain looked increasingly cornered by the clarity of the situation. Reddick Thorne stepped forward as if to speak, but Captain Vex cut him off with a sharp hand. "Not a word," the captain warned, his voice low, firm. "Not until I hear everything." Jalen tapped the side of his smartwatch, projecting 4 synchronized recordings onto the screen of the captain's tablet. They showed multiple angles of the assault from different rows. Each clip painted the same picture. Darien never moved, Corvin did. And he did so with intent. Darien waited for the captain to absorb what he was watching before continuing. Stratasine Technologies developed the incident auditing framework your airline uses to review in-flight conflict reports. The captain's eyes widened slightly, the implication slowly setting in. "I'm the CEO," Darien said simply, "which means I helped write the very protocol that determines how this moment will be judged." A ripple of recognition moved through the watching passengers. Some gasped, some exchanged stunned glances. The man they assumed was just another first-class traveler had, in truth, designed the system that governed airline accountability itself. Foreshadowing from earlier clicks now fell into place. The briefcase, the composure, the precise documentation. It had all been part of a larger framework of preparation. Darien took a small breath and pressed further. "Captain Vex, are you aware of a disciplinary file involving Mr. Corvin Hale, dated approximately 4 months ago? One marked internal only?" Corvin stiffened beside them, jaw clenched so tightly his neck twitched. The captain said nothing at first. A hesitation bloomed in the silence. It was brief, but noticeable. And in that space, Darien read everything he needed. "You are," he said, voice low and steady. "You saw it, and someone told you not to act on it." Captain Vex looked away, jaw tightening. He said nothing, but his silence was louder than an admission. A shadow had just moved inside the ranks, one that extended beyond the flight crew. The passengers watched, holding their breaths. Jalen stepped closer, whispering just loud enough for Darien to hear. "We might be sitting on a pattern. What if this wasn't just a rogue crew? What if he's been protected?" Darien nodded once, never breaking eye contact with the captain. "There's something else at play here," he said aloud. "Something behind this crew's confidence. Someone gave them reason to believe they were untouchable." Corvin's shoulders twitched. The mask was slipping. He turned slightly, as if to backpedal, but it was too late. The moment was cemented in recordings, testimonies, and blood. The narrative had moved on without him. The captain looked back toward the passengers, all now silent, waiting for what would come next. He met Darien's gaze, trying to hold onto some semblance of command. But even he knew this wasn't his cabin anymore. Darien stepped forward, the fork still in his wrapped hand, the briefcase now a vessel of evidence. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply stated what everyone was starting to realize. The truth isn't hiding anymore. It's walking straight toward you. "Step aside. Both of you," Captain Harlan Vex said, his voice firm but clearly rattled by the tension rippling through the cabin. Corvin Hale and Reddick Thorne hesitated. Their authority had visibly fractured, but they obeyed, backing away toward the rear galley as passengers watched with held breath. Darien Crosswell, still gripping the sanitized cloth wrapped around his bloodied hand, rose without a word. His posture was unshaken. His silence carried more weight than 1,000 arguments. The captain motioned him toward the front of the cabin. Jalen Merrick followed closely, carrying the matte black briefcase like it was more than just paperwork, like it held detonations of a different kind. The aisle split open for them as they walked. Whispers crackled in the pressurized air. "He's the CO." He didn't even flinch. "Is this bigger than just a fight?" Darien took a seat in the crew jump seat just behind the cockpit. It was the same seat Corvin had tried to dominate him from earlier. Now it became his vantage point. The hum of the aircraft was interrupted only by the occasional cough, the soft thrum of turbulence, and the buzz of passenger phones still recording. The captain knelt slightly in front of Darian, clearly struggling to maintain control. "Mr. Crosswell, I need your help calming the situation down. You clearly have influence over the cabin now." Darian looked up slowly, his expression unreadable. "Cooperation depends on one thing," he said, his tone clinical. "Transparency." Before the captain could respond, a quiet voice broke from mid-cabin. "If transparency is what you want, sir, I can help." All heads turned. A man in row 8 stood. He wore a plain blazer, his ID badge clipped to his belt in travel mode. His posture was unassuming, but his voice carried quiet authority. "My name is Bram Vale," he said, stepping forward. "I'm a junior compliance officer for Meridian Sky Airlines. I was off duty, headed to an audit in Verland, but I saw everything. And I can confirm this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was targeted. The effect was immediate." Corvin's face, visible behind the curtain, lost color. Reddick looked down at his shoes. Captain Vex blinked. "Wait, you're Meridian staff?" "Yes, and I've seen those too in reports before." Bram's voice grew stronger. "They were flagged in the internal document titled Crew Discord Index. Repeated incidents of aggressive passenger conduct. Especially," he hesitated, his voice dropping, "toward black male travelers." A collective chill passed through the air. Darian leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Why wasn't that acted on?" he asked. Bram looked away briefly, uncomfortable. "That's what I've been trying to understand. Our compliance team submitted the report months ago, but certain supervisors, they pushed back, told us to monitor but don't escalate." He fished his tablet from his seatback bag. "I kept a backup copy, just in case." The captain stood frozen as Bram approached and handed the device to Darian. The screen displayed the names of Corvin Hale and Reddick Thorne, dates, passenger complaints, internal notes. One line stood out in bold yellow, flag for escalation. Override halted by senior directive. Darian's jaw clenched, his eyes scanning every timestamp and reference. The record was damning, but one detail mattered more than the rest. "Who signed the blockage order?" he asked, voice flat. Bram hesitated. Silence stretched as long as the fuselage itself. Jalen stepped closer. The captain, too, waited for the answer like a verdict. Bram took a deep breath. "The override was signed by your own deputy director, Garrick Thorne." Darian froze. The moment was a sudden vertical drop in the middle of calm skies. His mind, trained to process 1,000 details at once, ran through the implications. Garrick Thorne wasn't just a deputy. He was the man who pushed Darian to board this flight. The man who claimed this route would be discreet. The man who had full access to internal compliance integration across both Meridian Sky and Stratosign's shared audit framework. "Repeat that," Darian said, though he had already heard it perfectly. "Garrick Thorne," Bram said again, quieter this time. He was the one who blocked the report. For the first time, something shifted behind Darian's eyes, betrayal tempered by restraint. He looked back toward the curtain separating the crew galley from the main cabin, where Corvin and Reddick now stood silently, pale and rigid. Their plan had never been theirs alone. They were pawns, tools in something orchestrated far above their pay grade. Darian exhaled, then turned to Jalen without a word. Jalen opened the briefcase with a click and began pulling out folders one by one. The captain took a step back, finally understanding this was no longer about a row between a passenger and crew. It was about a conspiracy unfolding at 30,000 feet. Passengers murmured. Bram swallowed and added, "Sir, I can stay seated if you need me to testify formally. I know the protocols." Darian gave a single nod. His voice, when it returned, was quiet but thunderous. "Good. Then let's start with the truth." And then came the line that closed the moment like a slammed vault door, spoken so precisely that no one could misquote it. Bram finally whispers the name of someone Darian never expected. "Your own deputy director, Garrick Thorne." He smirked, convinced the attack would intimidate, unaware that every move had been cataloged, every witness accounted for, and the termination orders were already ready. If you believe cruelty under a uniform always folds under strategy, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The revelation struck with the force of a falling aircraft. Bram's whispered confession, Garrick Thorne, hung in the narrow air of the cabin like a sudden pressure drop. Darian's breath tightened, not in fear, but in the sharp focus of a man realizing the ground beneath him was shifting. His jaw set, his posture straightened, and every calculation in his mind sharpened into clarity. He turned slowly toward Bram, studying the younger man's trembling hands as he held the tablet, its screen glowing with a hidden report that had been buried deep inside Meridian Sky's internal system. "Sit here," Darian said, pointing to the space beside him. His voice was calm, but the calmness carried weight. Bram obeyed instantly, dropping into the jump seat with the rigid posture of a man stepping onto a witness stand. Passengers leaned in from several rows back, their faces caught in the dim cabin lighting, curiosity, confusion, fear, and the dawning understanding that something far bigger than a Midair dispute was unfolding right in front of them. Darian gestured for Bram to turn the tablet. As the screen shifted toward him, a series of files loaded, each stamped confidential, each marked with disciplinary references. Bram's finger hovered uncertainly over the entries. "These were flagged months ago," he said quietly, his voice shaking with restrained frustration. But they weren't allowed to move to escalation. Darian leaned forward, scanning each detail with attentive precision. There were numerous formal complaints about Corvin's aggressive conduct, entries on Reddick's confrontations with male passengers, and inconsistencies in crew discipline logs. Several of the complaint timelines have been altered, delayed, rewritten, or digitally covered. But it was the message logs that froze Darian in a cold silence. Several supervisors had received direct instructions to delay disciplinary action, and each message ended with a signature tag, an encrypted marker traced back to Garrick Thorne. Jalen, still clutching the briefcase like a lifeline, shifted closer. "Why would Garrick interfere with these records?" he asked, the disbelief cracking through his normally steady tone. Darian didn't answer at first. He stared at the messages as if staring into Garrick's intentions. Garrick had been his deputy for 6 years, the man he trusted to manage external compliance, oversee aviation audits, and guide their upcoming corporate alliance. Yet here was proof that Garrick had been quietly undermining him, not in open conflict, but in the shadows where betrayal grows roots. "He didn't just interfere," Darian finally said, voice steady with controlled resolve. "He created cover." The captain, a tall, tense man who had been observing from a short distance, took a step back, as if distancing himself from the storm of corporate truth unraveling in front of him. Even he understood this was no longer just a flight. This was the exposure of a deeper rot. Passengers watched him retreat, understanding that even the authority of a cockpit meant little compared to what was unraveling in Part 8's narrow aisle. "Unlock Section 3, Darian ordered. Jalen froze, eyes widening. "Section 3? Sir, that's for corporate emergencies." "This qualifies," Darian replied. Jalen opened the briefcase with careful hands, lifting the protective layer and revealing a set of sealed termination packets. Thick envelopes, each with a silver crest embossed on the front and Darian's pre-authorized signature printed beside the emergency clause stamp. Passengers murmured among themselves, recognizing the weight of what they were seeing, even if they didn't fully understand its implications. "These were prepared for internal misuse cases," Jalen said softly, voice filled with disbelief. "I never imagined we'd need them here." "Neither did I," Darian murmured. Corvin and Reddick exchanged a panicked whisper from across the cabin. Corvin's voice trembled. "They told us he wouldn't fight back," he muttered to Reddick. "They promised protection." Darian lifted his eyes, cold and unwavering, hearing every word. The ambient hum of the engines deepened, as if amplifying the moment's gravity. Dramatic irony thickened. Corvin had expected Darian to crumble under pressure, unaware that the man he provoked was the architect of the very frameworks now unraveling their careers. Darian stepped closer, the termination packets under his arm, his blood-stained hand wrapped but still visible. He looked directly at Corvin with a gaze so steady it made even the passengers shiver. The tension stretched across the cabin like a tightened wire. "Someone told you I wouldn't fight back?" Darien asked, voice calm enough to cut through the air with precision. Corvin swallowed hard but said nothing. Darien took one more step, his presence radiating the controlled authority of a man who had rebuilt corporations from chaos. His voice dropped lower, colder, carrying the quiet strength of someone who has already seen the full truth and is now preparing to act on it. "Whoever promised you protection forgot who I am." The captain's hand hovered over the radio switch as he turned back toward Darien, eyes wide, voice low. "We're diverting. Emergency protocol says, not yet," Darien said firmly, raising his hand without looking away from Corvinhale. The cabin held its breath. Passengers glanced between Darien's blood-wrapped hand and the silent tension hanging in the air like pressurized gas. The captain hesitated, startled by the command in Darien's tone, and slowly stepped back. Darien took 2 measured breaths, centering his thoughts. "If we divert now," he said aloud, "they'll scrub the logs before we touch down. Every trace of this incident, erased by the time we explain it." He turned to Jalen, who already had the briefcase open across his lap, his fingers trembling slightly over a tablet. Bram Vale, the junior compliance officer, had joined them by the crew jump seat, his face pale but alert. "Run the audit protocol," Darien said. "All footage, all witness files. Route everything through Stratosign's encrypted server." Jalen nodded without hesitation and began uploading files. Bram activated his own secure diagnostic software, syncing passenger devices, including Darien's smartwatch, with the aircraft's onboard Wi-Fi. The hum of the engines now competed with murmurs of confusion, camera shutters, and passengers whispering updates to their live streams. The cabin no longer belonged to the crew, it belonged to truth. Darien stepped toward Corvin, his voice measured and low. "Who gave the order?" Corvin shifted his weight, jaw twitching. He looked away once, twice, but Darien didn't move. "I'll ask again. Who told you to provoke me?" For a moment, Corvin's face cracked, not with arrogance, but fear. I don't know his real name," he muttered. "Then give me what you do know." He called himself Ravex. "Just Ravex." Jalen looked up sharply. Bram froze. Darien narrowed his eyes. "Say that again." Corvin nodded hesitantly. "Ravex said if I followed instructions, push you hard, shake you up, escalate, it'd guarantee me career protection. Said no matter what happened, you wouldn't fight back." Darien's lips barely moved. "You were told I wouldn't fight back?" Corvin gave a hollow nod, sweat now forming at his temple. Jalen turned his tablet around. "Sir, there are Ravex-linked encryption signatures in our old internal compliance logs. They're embedded in dormant security lines, ones Garrick was supposed to purge months ago." A hush fell over the area. Darien's thoughts churned in silence. Garrick Thorne, the deputy director who had pushed for this trip, rushed the timelines, and promised airtight crew compliance. It wasn't a coincidence. Ravex wasn't just an alias, it was a corporate mask. And someone inside had used it to turn this flight into a trap. He turned to Reddick Thorne now, who stood against the curtain, arms crossed too tightly to be casual. "You knew too, didn't you?" Reddick looked away. "We were told you'd make a scene, that it'd be easy to paint you as hostile. And yet," Darien said, raising his hand with the bloodied bandage, "you're the ones who drew first blood." The weight of the moment pressed into every seat. Darien turned, unbuckled a leather strap inside the briefcase, and removed a slim folder stamped in deep blue, Corporate Bylaw 14B, Emergency Termination Protocol. He opened the folder slowly, methodically, while Bram began recording from second angle and passengers stood to film the act. Jalen retrieved a digital stylus. Darien signed once, twice, then pressed his palm print against the biometric signature pad on the final page. The lights in the folder's corner blinked green. Corvin's breath caught audibly as he recognized the formality of what had just happened. "You, what is that?" he asked, stepping forward a half-inch before catching himself. Darien held the signed termination notice at eye level, his voice slicing through the cabin like steel against glass. "Under Stratosign's corporate charter, ratified by every airline we contract with. I have the right to terminate employee partnerships under hostile conditions, effective immediately. His gaze pierced straight through Corvin. That includes provocation, assault, and attempted sabotage. Reddick's knees buckled slightly. Corvin took a half step back. Bram cleared his throat, breaking the silence with one final question. What now? Darian handed the signed termination to Jalen, then turned to face the rows of cameras, passengers, and a captain who now stood speechless in the galley. He gave no grand speech, no theatrical gesture, only a single, resolute sentence. This is the beginning, not the end. The pen sliced cleanly across the thick termination document, Darian's grip on the pen unshaken despite the gauze cinched around his bleeding hand. The ink barely dried before he folded the form once and turned it outward for the cabin to see, his signature, final and absolute. Corvin stared at it as if it were guillotine. His chest heaved, his mouth twitched, but no words formed. The confidence he wore earlier, the smugness, the veiled threats gone. All that remained was the disbelief of a man who finally understood what real consequences felt like. Reddick rose halfway from his seat, muttering something about needing air, but Captain Vex stepped sideways, blocking the aisle with a firm hand. "You'll sit down until this audit is complete," he said flatly, his voice no longer carrying the softness of command but the cold weight of legal obligation. The cabin around them was hushed, save for the rhythmic tapping of Bram Vale's fingers across his tablet. Each stroke uploaded another packet of passenger video, crew misconduct, and voice recordings to the secure server Darian had activated minutes earlier. Every file was an arrow aimed directly at the heart of the airline's credibility. Then Bram's finger stopped. The screen turned red. Unauthorized access attempt detected. It flashed. Gasps scattered across the rows like dropped glass. Bram's throat tightened. Someone's trying to erase the files. From the ground. They're inside the system. Darian's eyes darkened. Lock everything down. Now. Without hesitation, Jalen slid open a compartment on the briefcase and retrieved a black slab, the portable emergency server designed for critical isolation. He powered it on and synchronized it with Bram's tablet, intercepting the stream of stolen packets and rerouting them to an encrypted vault unreachable from outside the aircraft. Darian turned to the captain. "I need you to isolate the aircraft's internal network. No data in or out." Vex blinked, hesitated, then nodded. He reached toward the control panel on the bulkhead and began sealing Ofcom's access, one toggle at a time. "You really think this was just about a fork?" Darian asked aloud, not looking at anyone in particular, but his voice pierced the tense silence. This wasn't rage. This was planned. Reddick tried to interject again. We didn't know what this was about. We were just told to act firm." Darian's head snapped toward him. One look shut him up completely. His words hadn't carried guilt, only the fear of being caught in something much larger. Then the cabin lights flickered. Not the gentle tremble of turbulence. Not a random blink. This was a stuttering, rhythmic pulse. Mechanical. Deliberate. Darian's instincts surged. He'd seen it before. Manual override attempts disguised to look like technical malfunctions. The cabin darkened for 3 full seconds before stabilizing. When the lights steadied, Bram was already rising from his seat. "Sir," he said, urgency flooding his voice, "someone is tampering with the aircraft systems." "Find the panels," Darian ordered. "Now." Bram and Jalen began scanning the cabin, eyes darting along the overhead edges and sidewalls, searching for signs of tampering, smudges, scratches, disturbed casing. Then Darian spotted it. Row 11. A man slouched in his seat, body angled awkwardly toward the wall. His jacket sleeve was lifted just enough to reveal movement underneath. A square metal plate, clearly a crew-only maintenance panel, hung slightly open, a key protruding from the lock. Darian moved before thinking, standing tall and cutting across the aisle with a precision that commanded attention. The man didn't notice him until it was too late. "What exactly are you trying to shut down?" Darian's voice was calm. Too calm. Cold, calculated, and loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. The man jolted upright. He was wiry, maybe early 40s, face pale, forehead wet. He offered a weak smile. I was just curious, sir. I was looking at the, airflow system. Shut it, Darian said, low and unwavering. You're not crew. That panel doesn't belong to you. Who gave you the key? The man hesitated, clutching the edge of his seat like a ledge. Name, Darian demanded. Arvin Locke, the man stammered, eyes flickering to the passengers now raising their phones to record. Systems technician. I'm off duty. Just traveling. Jalen's hands moved fast, scanning the man's badge through his tablet's lens. Confirmed, he said after a pause. But he's been flagged twice before for accessing restricted networks in ground audits. Twice. Darian's eyes narrowed. And he's allowed to board unsecured. Bram's voice cracked from behind. He's in the database. He was warned. Never fired. The man, Arvin, held up his hands now. I swear, I just got a message. An encrypted one. It told me to activate a cabin disconnect if I saw a certain signal. That's all. I don't know why. Who sent it? Darian stepped closer, ignoring the burning pain flaring in his injured hand. I don't know. They didn't sign it with a name. Just a code name. Which was Ravex. A silence deeper than anything before blanketed the entire cabin. Even the air seemed to pause. The name hit like a cold hammer. Captain Vex's head whipped around, eyes wide with disbelief. Jalen looked as if he'd been punched. Arvin's face crumpled as if realizing, too late, that the name held more weight than he could understand. Please, he said, his voice trembling. I didn't know what I was really part of. He tried to flee, lunging toward the aisle in a last, desperate attempt to run. Darian moved. He didn't yell, didn't shove. He simply stepped forward with a shoulder angled just enough to intercept Arvin mid-sprint. The technician slammed into Darian's chest and rebounded off, stumbling back into a passenger who rose to block him. Another man from across the aisle stepped in, forming a wall. Within seconds, the cabin became a barricade. Darian gestured to the captain. Restrain him in the jump seat. Now. Vex nodded, snapping out of his shock. Two attendants, new ones, visibly nervous but obedient, stepped in with zip ties and guided Arvin back to the front of the aircraft. As they passed, Arvin's final words spilled out in one breathless, panicked confession. It was all meant to trigger a legal scandal. The Fork attack, the accusations, they wanted to damage Stratosign's value before the board meeting. They knew you'd fight back. They wanted it to look like aggression. Darian didn't blink. He turned back toward Bram and spoke quietly, with the force of someone who had waited long enough. Trace Ravex's last transmission. I want to know exactly where it came from and when. Bram began scanning, fingers dancing faster than before. Jalen stood guard near the briefcase, his posture squared, his expression steady. Darian walked forward to the front of the plane, past the rows of recording passengers, past Corvin's shrinking form, past the still trembling Reddick. He stood at the cabin entrance, hands still wrapped in cloth, his silhouette framed by the sterile cabin light. And with a voice strong enough to cut through the air like a blade, he declared, whatever you're trying to shut down ends right now. The man in row 11 froze the moment Darian's eyes locked onto him. He had just begun sliding the narrow maintenance panel back into place, his fingers trembling slightly from the awkward grip. But now, under the watchful silence of dozens of alert passengers and the sharp gaze of Darian Crosswell, his motions halted. Several passengers, already primed by the earlier attack, instinctively raised their phones again, recording without a word. The tension was immediate, electric. No one moved. No one dared speak first. The man rose slowly from his seat, a faint tremor in his knees betraying the calm facade he tried to wear. I was just curious about the wiring, he offered, lifting both hands in an open gesture, trying to mimic innocence. His voice cracked halfway through the sentence. But Darian didn't blink. Years of facing billion-dollar deals under pressure had taught him how to spot deception in its earliest breath. And this man reeked of instructions, precise, premeditated, mechanical. Jalen stepped into the aisle behind Darian, tablet in hand. He's got a badge, he muttered, angling the lens of the tablet toward the man's waist. A soft beep confirmed the scan. Name tag, says Arvin Locke. Jalen continued. Ground systems technician. Listed as off-duty staff. At the sound of the name, Bram Vale stiffened. The junior compliance officer turned fully toward the man, his voice low but urgent. That's him. He's been flagged twice. Accessed restricted maintenance channels during layovers in Ravelin and Westmere. He looked at Darian, his eyes grim. I marked the file myself, but nothing came of it. Darian stepped forward, blood-stained bandage still firm around his hand, the pain barely showing in his face. The aisle seemed to shrink around him as he approached Arvin Locke. Every eye watched. Every breath waited. What part did you play? Darian asked, his voice a calm blade. Arvin opened his mouth, but only air came out. His gaze darted between Darian, the captain, and the cameras. I was told to initiate a disconnect sequence, he stammered, licking his lips. Cabin comms. Maintenance panel was step 1. Who told you? Darian's question came sharp and immediate, like it was already being typed into a legal transcript. Arvin's voice dropped to a whisper. The one who calls himself. Ravex. A collective gasp rolled through the cabin. Even Captain Harlan Vex, who had just emerged from the cockpit again, stopped mid-step. The air changed, thickened. The name had finally been spoken aloud. Arvin realized too late the depth of his mistake. Panic surged behind his eyes. He lurched forward, trying to bolt down the aisle, but Darian moved with practiced speed. With his uninjured arm, he stepped into the path and extended it firmly across the aisle. Arvin collided into him with a grunt, rebounding like a wave hitting steel. The injured hand never flinched. Behind Darian, 2 passengers slid into place, forming a physical blockade that trapped Arvin mid-aisle. A younger man stepped forward, arms crossed, and a gray-haired passenger in row 12 simply said, "Sit down." Cornered, Arvin's fight drained from him. Darian nodded to the captain, who swiftly motioned to one of the attendants still loyal to order. "Restrain him." "Jump seat," the captain ordered. The attendants hesitated until Darian repeated, "He sabotaged this aircraft. Restrain him now." The command in his voice was unshakable. Arvin was pulled toward the crew seat, hands trembling as they were bound with emergency restraints. The cabin was eerily quiet again, the only sound the low thrum of the engines and the occasional click of a phone camera. Arvin, breathing heavily, leaned back against the panel and finally spoke without prompting. "You don't get it," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "This was never supposed to go this far. Ravex, he said if Corvin could provoke you, cause a scandal, make it messy, it would tank your company's valuation before the board meeting. That's all." Darian didn't respond at first. His face didn't move, but his jaw clenched once. Jalen's hands hovered over his tablet. Bram's fingers were already typing, cross-referencing timestamps. Captain Vex watched it all, bewildered. The truth was spiraling outward like smoke from a fire started below deck, and now the flame had a name. Darian turned slowly, his body still blocking the aisle. He took in the restrained saboteur, the recording phones, the stunned captain, and the still pale faces of Corvin and Reddick sitting silently near the curtain. Every piece of the conspiracy had surfaced in less than an hour, and yet he knew this was only the beginning. He looked directly at Bram and said, "Start a full trace on Ravex's last signal." Bram gave a tight nod and dropped into the nearest aisle seat, fingers dancing across his keyboard, connecting to the secure Stratasine server through his encrypted uplink. Darian took one last look across the cabin. He saw in the faces of the passengers something rare. Not just fear or concern, but resolve. A shared determination that this time they weren't just witnessing injustice. They were helping stop it. And then he turned back to the front of the aircraft, his posture tall, his voice now calm and undeniable. "We land on my terms, not Ravex's." The plane began its descent. The seatbelt lights glowed overhead as the nose dipped, but inside the first-class cabin, the pressure wasn't from altitude, it was from revelation. Darian Crosswell stood in the aisle, unmoved by the shift in gravity, his mind sharper than ever. His voice sliced through the murmuring cabin as he turned to Jalen and said with quiet command, Send the encrypted memo. Oversight chairman only. Flag at priority red. Jalen Merrick, still clutching the titanium briefcase, opened the lid with practiced care. The dim lighting shimmered off the brushed metal, revealing biometric locked compartments. His fingers flew across the tablet as he activated a private satellite channel through Stratosign's executive relay, inputting the security key Darian had spoken only once in their 5 years working together. A soft ping confirmed transmission. At the same time, Darian's gaze swept across the rows ahead. Corvin Hale sat several seats away, restrained by presence more than handcuffs. The same fork that had pierced Darian's hand now rested sealed in a transparent evidence pouch, clipped to the inside of the briefcase. Corvin wasn't speaking anymore. He wasn't smirking. He wasn't even blinking often. His hands trembled faintly against his knees, as if trying not to draw attention to his unraveling. He knew. He knew the recordings had gone live. He knew his assault had been documented from multiple angles. He knew Darian had signed the termination order with that same injured hand, and that the airline's reputation, his career, were already collapsing before the wheels had even touched the ground. Bram Vale, hunched over his own device in the seat across the aisle, looked up with sudden focus. "Sir," he said, voice low but urgent, "I finished tracing the source. The origin of the encrypted commands, the ones Corvin and Reddick received. It's not external. It came from a dormant server cloaked under your own company's firewall." Darian's brow tensed. "What server?" Bram rotated the tablet and showed the blinking line of code like a confession. It was masked under a legacy node from something called Project Vylon. Time froze for a breath. Darian's expression didn't shift outwardly, but the storm behind his eyes was unmistakable. Project Vylon, a discontinued system they'd shelved 3 years ago under Garrick Thorne's supervision. It had been meant for emergency communication during high-risk product testing, never meant to be kept. Darian had explicitly told Garrick to erase the channels. Garrick had assured him it had been done, but he hadn't. Instead, he had kept Vylon alive, repurposed it, hidden it in plain sight, and used it as the ghost network for Ravex, the false identity manipulating everything from behind the curtain. The betrayal wasn't just strategic now. It was personal. Darian turned to Jalen without hesitation. Every recording, every log, every chain of custody, compile it into a single evidence brief. "Yes, sir," Jalen replied, fingers moving with a speed that mirrored the urgency now bleeding through the cabin. The engines rumbled louder as the flaps adjusted. The landing gear locked in with a heavy, final-sounding thud. Outside the window, clouds split into rows like stadium lights. The city of Avalar glowed beneath them, unaware that justice was arriving in real time at 33,000 feet. Inside, Darian's body moved with purpose. Pain radiated from his bandaged hand, but his grip on the digital pen didn't shake. Jalen passed him the summary tablet. On screen were the documented violations of Corvin Hale, Reddick Thorne, and Arvin Locke, each with attached time-stamped footage and corroborated testimony. Darian's thumb hovered over the biometric field for a moment, then pressed firmly. Beep. Signature complete. Gasps fluttered through the front cabin, not from surprise, but from reverence. Passengers who had watched the entire ordeal unfold were now witnesses to something rare, a man taking back control without ever losing it. Reddick stared at the floor, lips parted slightly like a man who had just seen his own career obituary scroll across a screen. Corvin pressed himself deeper into the seat, face drained of all the cruelty it once held. Darian didn't speak to them. Instead, he stared at the exit door like a general studying the battlefield before the final charge. His thoughts moved ahead, past the tarmac, past the media, past the investigation waiting like floodgates ready to burst. Everything had changed now. The sabotage wasn't speculation, it was proven. Project Vylon would expose Garrick Thorne's duplicity to the board and beyond. The system Garrick built in the shadows would become the very spotlight that burned him. A notification vibrated on Jalen's tablet. Board received. Emergency meeting convened. Awaiting ground confirmation. Darian gave a single nod. The cabin intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice said, this time with something closer to respect. "We'll be landing in approximately 3 minutes. Please remain seated." But Darian didn't sit. He stood tall, bandaged hand by his side, shoulders squared, eyes locked forward. Every part of him was a signal, a symbol, a man walking through fire not to escape, but to expose who lit it. He turned slightly to Jalen, voice quiet, final, and certain. "The moment we step off this plane, everything changes." The aircraft touched down with a thundering jolt, hard enough that some passengers instinctively reached for the seats in front of them. But Darian Croswell did not flinch. He remained upright, standing in the aisle even before the seatbelt sign blinked off. His left hand, bandaged and still faintly stained with dried blood beneath the gauze, hung at his side like a reminder of violence endured, but also of resolve untouched. The cabin door clicked, unsealing with a hiss as the bridge aligned. Outside the glass, a small army had assembled, ground officials, security agents, and Meridian Sky supervisors, all braced for chaos. They expected disorder. What they received was Darian stepping out first, calm as ever, flanked by Jalen Merrick and Bramvale. In Jalen's hands was the briefcase, no longer a tool of business, but an archive of accountability. As the trio exited the plane, a hushed wave passed through the waiting personnel, like a wind hitting a tree line. Flashbulbs popped behind the terminal glass where press had gathered. Darian walked with the stillness of someone who had already won, though his steps carried the weight of a nation watching. Warren Kelvick, head of operations, stepped forward with a clipboard and forced composure. "Mr. Croswell," he began, "we're here to look into the matter and support the crew during this." But Darian didn't wait. Without slowing, without emotion, he raised his hand and placed a sealed envelope directly into Warren's palm. Warren paused, looked down, then opened the packet. His eyes scanned the contents. His breath caught. "These aren't incident reports," he muttered aloud. "They're termination orders. Signed under Corporate Clause 14B, Darian said, his voice low but firm. "Effective immediately." Behind them, 2 guards appeared at the cabin door and began escorting Reddick Thorne and Corvin Hale off the aircraft. The 2 attendants looked less like professionals and more like prisoners in disbelief. Their faces were pale, their uniforms wrinkled, their movements clumsy under the weight of humiliation. The passengers booed loudly. Someone shouted, "That man saved us." Cameras surged forward. The lie they had once counted on, Darian's silence, had been shattered. Then a 3rd escort emerged. Arvin Locke, the ground tech who had tried to disable the system mid-flight, was led past the crowd in handcuffs, his face twisted in defeat. A black, unmarked van waited at the curb. The side door opened. 2 security officers motioned. Arvin stepped inside with no protest. At that moment, Jalen's tablet vibrated. He checked it, his eyes flicking rapidly across the screen. "Stratasine board just voted," he said, holding out for Darian to see. "Garrick Thorne's been removed. Federal inquiry into Project Vylon has already begun." Darian gave a slow nod. A shadow passed over his face, but it didn't break him. He turned toward the long wall of glass that separated them from the media. Behind it, dozens of reporters waited with microphones raised, hungry for a statement. Darian walked forward. The moment he reached the glass, the crowd went silent. Through the glass, they could see the blood-stained gauze, the fatigue in his posture, the bite of betrayal in his jawline. But they also saw something else, conviction. Darian raised his voice just enough to carry through the terminal. "Sabotage," he said, "cannot be hidden behind uniforms, ranks, or corrupted protocols." Flashes burst like lightning. A reporter shouted, "What happens next, Mr. Croswell? What do you intend to do?" Darian didn't pause. "I'm initiating a new corporate passenger protection protocol, effective today. A framework to prevent what happened here from ever happening again. It's called the Croswell Integrity Order." Gasps. Typing. A cascade of questions. But Darian had said what needed to be said. He turned slightly, looking back toward the open door of the aircraft. The flight that had begun as a business journey had become something far greater, an exposé, a trial, a reckoning. He knew the moment he'd been stabbed, the story was no longer about a fork. It was about a system designed to fail people like him. He inhaled slowly, eyes steady, and with the whole world listening, he spoke the words that would echo far beyond the terminal. Justice begins when silence ends. He stabbed the CEO's hand and froze as the CEO calmly pulled the fork out and signed the flight crew's termination orders moments later. If you believe true authority acts with precision, subscribe now, because justice always lands exactly where it should. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights racism, abuse of authority, and the power of composure and strategic action in confronting prejudice. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, accountability, and respect for every passenger.